It's borderline whitewashing the situation to call it a ceasefire. It is a humiliating surrender to Hamas. Hamas is still in power, and that's all you need to know. They're still in control of parts of Gaza. They're making a show of force. They marched into the streets and they're parading for propaganda purposes. It's a slap in the face of the Israeli military, which was capable of defeating Hamas, but refused to do so. And it's a slap in the face of all those Israelis who fell and died in this combat.
This deal had been undertaken entirely under the Biden administration. Trump and his supporters would be attacking it. They would be attacking it rightly. They would be attacking it precisely because of all the concessions that it makes to Gaza and to Hamas, precisely because it's rewarding them with humanitarian aid. The problem with Trump's proposal is not the so-called ethnic cleansing. It's that in spite of moving them out of the country, it's still going to reward them.
The question on the table is what happens to the Hamas supporting inhabitants of Gaza? That's the wrong question. I don't care about any of those things. First question, the paramount question, what are the Palestinians going to do to right the wrongs they committed?
On January 15th, 2025, days before the transfer of power between the Biden and Trump administrations, the latest ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas was announced. Trump called it epic. Then on Tuesday, February 4th, Trump announced that he would support building beautiful new homes for the residents of Gaza, location still to be determined. Are these deals with the terrorist organization Hamas really epic or beautiful, as Trump describes them, or be better to describe them as moral travesties? That is a question we will pursue today on the Ayn Rand Institute podcast. I'm Ben Bayer, fellow at ARI. With me is senior fellow Elan Journo. Elan, you've been following the story of Israel versus Hamas, October 7th, the broader Israel-Palestine question for years now. I think you're an expert on this subject. What is your overall take on this before we start to dig into any of the details?
These are egregious moral failings, both on the part of the Biden and Trump administrations, who are both claiming credit for the ceasefire. And I think what most people have not recognized, it's a failing on the part of Israeli government for not defeating Hamas. That's the first egregious moral failing here. And I think the second one is what might be described as a policy of real estate development in the Gaza Strip. I think there's a lot of things that are revealing about the mentality that we see governing this decision. I think that itself is really bizarre and worthy of analysis.
Yeah, Ilana, we've been at the Ayn Rand Institute, we've been covering the story about the Israel-Hamas war since day one, since October 7th. We've been urging Israel to take dramatic action against Hamas, which has been a constant aggressor against Israel for decades now. And I have to admit that at times, since October 7th, it looked like Israel was actually stepping up a bit more than we expected to in certain regards. But then that's what makes this latest deal, I think, all the more distressing and outrageous. And if you look at especially the kind of rhetoric you saw coming out of the Netanyahu administration in Israel, there was constant attention to how we need victory over Hamas, not just one more cycle of retribution, but there was, at least for moments, there was talk of let's finally end this thing now that we realize what they're really capable of. And this deal seems to put all of that into the memory hole. It seems to say, no, after all, we're not going for victory. After all, we're just going to repeat the constant cycle of violence and ceasefire once again. And there's more to say about it, but did you want to comment on particularly that cyclical issue? Because there have been so many of these in the past.
Yeah. I'm outraged. And I think everybody, whether you have an interest in the region as I do professionally, or you're watching this, anyone concerned with what's happened since October 7th should be outraged. there are so many ways in which this has been rewritten. And so you made a reference to memory holes, which is a feature in George Orwell's 1984, where the government rewrites history actively and constantly to shape the narrative. This is an active case of rewriting history. You put it as there were moments where we were told that the rhetoric was nothing less than victory or total victory. We have to defeat Hamas. None of that is either true or has been acknowledged to be changed. So we've had a continual defining down of what the standard of success looks like. And I even object to calling this a ceasefire, because in some ways, ceasefire has a certain moral standing that you're face to face with an adversary that you can make a deal with. The reality is October 6th was a moment when there was a ceasefire in place. And so it's completely ludicrous. And I think it's borderline whitewashing the situation to call it a ceasefire. Now, to me, this isn't only a defining down of the standard. This is not only a failing. It is a humiliating surrender to Hamas. And you raise this issue of there's been numerous rounds of war between Israel and Hamas prior to October 7th. And there's a question of whether we'll get more. Hamas is still in power, and that's all you need to know. They're still in control of parts of Gaza, not the whole of Gaza as they were prior, but enough of it that they're making a show of force. So moments after this was all announced, they marched into the streets, their soldiers and their police officers in garb. Now suddenly they're willing to wear uniform, not when they're fighting, but when they're parading for propaganda purposes. And we see flags and bunting and celebrations. Notice, on top of all of this, the way in which they're demonstrating their power over Gaza. It's a slap in the face of the Israeli military, which was capable of defeating Hamas, but refused to do so. And it's a slap in the face of all those Israelis who fell and died in this combat. Now, notice as well that we should talk more about the hostage handover, but this is another dimension of the way in which this is a humiliation. Hamas is deliberately rubbing the nose of Israel, the United States, and everyone who was behind the ceasefire. When these hostages were handed over by Hamas, they went out of their way to humiliate the hostages. They commanded them to smile and thank them. They gave them certificates of release. They made propaganda videos that they are going to use on social media. All of this is further proof that Hamas is far from defeated. There's enough of it left, and that is the moral travesty here. There's enough of Hamas left that it is capable of demonstrating its position of power and its humiliation of Israel. And I really think this is a humiliating surrender by Israel, because it's a choice. It's not that they had no other option. This is a choice, and this will lead to what you're concerned about, which is this idea of a repeated cycle of more attacks by Hamas, because this is what they're doing is encouraging Hamas in the belief, yes, Hamas, you lost a lot of people. Thousands of your fighters are gone. That is not a deterrent to them, because they are still up. They fought Israel to a standstill and a ceasefire on top of it. So to me, it almost guarantees that we will see further aggression from Hamas, because it's not gone. The idea of Hamas is not gone. So this is one way in which I think it's crucial to see this as it's a humiliating surrender to Hamas, and it can only bring more aggression and suffering.
You mentioned the hostage exchange, and I want to get to that in just a few seconds, but it's worth noting we're recording this on Wednesday, February 12th, and just yesterday, after he had made his announcement about the real estate deal, President Trump started talking about how if all of the hostages aren't released by Saturday at noon, there will be hell to pay, unspecified hell, not by us, maybe by Israel. So it might be that this cycle just starts again as soon as Saturday. But going back to the hostages, I think it's worth noting that whatever happens Saturday, a lot of damage has already been done because the terms of the deal were so one-sided in favor of Hamas. They're the ones who are really benefiting here. The terms of the deal were to release 33 Israeli hostages, not all of them, in exchange for 1,000 Gazan prisoners, many of whom I'm pretty sure have already been released now. And these include prisoners with life sentences, basically the worst punishment you can get in Israel. So that's going to include murderers. It's going to include terrorists. As I understand, it wasn't any of the people involved in October 7th, but it was presumably people involved in previous attacks. And what I found most galling was that the terms of the agreement specifically mention that 47 of the Gazan prisoners who have to be turned back are 47 so-called shalit prisoners. And what this refers to is Gazans who were released in the last prisoner exchange in exchange for the Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit, who then went on to attack Israel again after they had been released and then were recaptured. And now they have to be released a second time, which I see as just really rubbing salt in the wounds and there for pure propaganda value as a kind of dancing on the graves of the Israelis that these prisoners have already killed and will likely kill again. And one symbol of that is the fact that one of the prisoners previously exchanged in the Shalit exchange was Sinwar, who's the guy who went on to plan the October 7th attacks. So like the people that Israel is releasing now, some of them are probably going to go on to plan and execute whatever the next round of attacks on Israel is going to be when Hamas, in whatever form, whatever venue, inevitably breaks this deal.
I want to add to what you're saying here, which is just the sheer lopsidedness of this. I think people should reflect on. It might be strange to describe it this way because Israel is nominally a Jewish country, but it does strike me as a love your enemy kind of response, and giving them more of what than they deserve, giving them. It's an outrageous ratio of prisoners, and some of the people that Israel is seeking the release of are already dead. So we're talking about the release of corpses. You mentioned the release of prisoners who already are under life sentences, are murderers. Some of them are responsible for terrorist attacks many years ago. I think that an important thing to look at here is that this is exactly the kind of thing that you would expect from a government that is refusing to learn from its past mistakes and past governments' mistakes and past governments before them, whoever was in power. There's a kind of anti-conceptual perspective to this. Like, well, what do you think is going to happen when you release 1,000 Gazans who previously were captured, previously escaped, and then captured again, only to commit more attacks? It's almost to the point where you can't parody this. And you pointed to Sinwar, who himself was released. The thing that deserves added emphasis here is that many people might be thinking, well, the Hamas really lost trust with the people of Gaza. Look what they left them. It's rubble. How could they possibly expect to have the support of the Gazan people? And what's little recognized is that the release of prisoners has so much emphasis for the people who support Hamas. So this goes a long way to make Hamas popular, because not only did Hamas win this fight because they reached a stalemate, they're able to release 1,000 prisoners. Think more than 1,000 families are going to have people coming back, people who are known to be guilty, who are confessed murderers and who are celebrated for being terrorists. They're being released. Now think about what that means. We not only are able to smite this mighty country, Israel, we're not only able to fight them to a standstill, we're able to get our people back and fight another day. Now that, I think, is, insofar as there are people who are still questioning whether they're supportive of Hamas, and I think that is worth pausing on as well, this repairs the relationship, because steadfastness, there's a word for this, it has a really significant connotation in the Palestinian community. Steadfastness of the resistance, that Hamas and before them the PLO. This is such strong evidence that Hamas is the one that has the moral confidence in this fight. The release of the prisoners is a massive reward to all those who Hamas is trying to win back the support of, who might feel like, well, I don't have a home anymore, but you know what? Doesn't matter, because we got our people back. That really it's flying under the radar in terms of people's recognition for how significant this is. And there's one other point that we should mention before we move on, and that is, I think Israeli society is being ripped apart by the desire to have all the hostages back. And I completely understand that. It is an atrocity that they've been held for so long. And I would love to see them all home. And every time a hostage is released, I think any sensible person would welcome that and celebrate their release and their removal from captivity. I think there is a kind of short-sightedness in the most benevolent interpretation of it within Israeli society, that this is the idea that you can bargain back with Hamas in order to get the hostages back. I think it's a false bargain. What I would have preferred to see is the Israeli forces defeat Hamas and win the war, and therefore release the hostages, not with all the strings attached, not with all the opportunities for Hamas to parade them, humiliate them, and humiliate the Israelis. So I think, of course, everyone would love to see the hostages released, and that's right and proper. But the pressure to cut a deal with Hamas, I think, is equally mistaken in the same way that the policy of the government is to do so.
Yeah, especially when hostage releases today are likely going to guarantee just more hostages taken in the future. And you mentioned that this all seems to be an example of governments failing to learn from the past. It's at least that. But what it might be, which is worse, is knowing what's happened in the past and acting in defiance of that knowledge. Because how could they not know that this has happened in the past? I strongly suspect that it's simply an issue of short-sightedness and not really caring about the long-term consequences, because one leader comes in, another leader will have to deal with it in the future. And here I'm not just talking about Netanyahu, but I'm talking about President Trump, because there's pretty good evidence that Netanyahu wanted very much, well, at least didn't want many of the details of this deal, but was pressured heavily by the Trump administration. There was the Trump-appointed envoy, Steve Witkoff, went to Israel before the inauguration, pressured the Israelis heavily to give in to the terms of this deal. And it's hard to know exactly what might have motivated President Trump to want to do this. One suspects that it was the PR value of being able to claim that he had secured an epic deal just before his inauguration, trying to mimic what happened with Reagan's release of the hostages before his inauguration in 1981. Of course, it's something that's underappreciated, I think, even about that aspect of history, is that the Iranian hostages were released in good part because of the Carter administration's offer of various forms of humanitarian sanctions relief, access to assets. Just like here, Trump is taking credit for the same kinds of humanitarian concessions that were being offered by the Biden administration. I mean, it wasn't just a ceasefire. It was also forcing Israel to make certain strategic withdrawals from strategic positions, like in the Philadelphia corridor, and giving Gaza more humanitarian aid. So the idea of we can score a PR value win in terms of this short-term victory without looking at the long term is just too much of a signature of the short-sightedness of American foreign policy, to say the least.
One quick thing on that, and then I want to bring back the issue of how we ended up in this position. I think if Biden were or Harris were in power right now, they would similarly be taking credit, because this, as many people point out, the contours of this deal are not different from the ones that were put on the table while Biden was in power. So it's in that sense, it's damning of whoever thinks this is a good idea. It isn't peculiarly Trump, that we will get to a peculiarly Trump kind of aspect of this response, which is the real estate deal. I want to go back to the issue of how we got to the point where Hamas has won this humiliating surrender from Israel. And I think I mentioned it in passing, but I want to put emphasis on it, because I think there's two aspects to this. One is Israel could have and should have morally defeated Hamas. This is something we called for on October 7th. We called for it many years before in prior conflict between Israel and Hamas. This is something I write about in my book, What Justice Demands. It's an ongoing, unresolved necessity for Israel to defeat this movement, this Islamist totalitarian faction that's leading the Palestinian movement. It was morally right to do that. And Israel had the military capability to do so. It did not do so. And it was a choice, as I pointed out earlier. And it's important to stress that a significant part of what animates this choice is a certain moral view that is self-effacing, self-sacrificial. It's self-humiliating in effect, because that's what it leads to in practice. You can see it in the way that Israel makes a show and is proud of the fact that it goes out of its way to protect civilians in hostile territory. And we've talked about this. You've written about this, Ben. We've done numerous podcasts about this, when the issue on the table was Israel's conduct in the war itself many months ago. The issue there is that is the wrong moral principle to guide your actions. It's self-sacrificial. And because of this, Israel fought in such a way that it would capture territory in Gaza, clear it, and move on, only to allow the Hamas fighters to regroup in those areas and then have to go back and clear it again. And so it was whack-a-mole isn't really dignified enough to describe it, but it was a deliberately non-successful military campaign. And it was animated by a certain moral perspective that they have to bow to pressure and their own conscience, their own sense of what is right to do in combat, such that the multitude of people who are pro-Hamas supporters in Gaza were treated as innocent civilians, and Israel went out of its way to the point of endangering its own people. And here we are, it's February, roughly 500 days since October 7th, and Hamas is in power, and it is such that it is deciding the terms of this prisoner exchange. And it is, you put it as dancing on the grave of some of the soldiers. There is literally a handover that they conducted for some of the Israeli hostages, where they put up a sign: "This is the graveyard of a particular troop that died here, where we killed them." And that is where they chose to release the hostages. They released other hostages in front of the home of Sinwar. Symbolic, purposely so, because this is part of what the propaganda victory is for Hamas. They have succeeded, and I think that's the price of a self-sacrificial policy. And then you added, just to tie this into what they're now doing with opening up so-called humanitarian aid, and I call it so-called because it's not humanitarian at all. It's not a real concern with human life to channel aid into Gaza. Now, having fought a self-sacrificial war, they're adding to this, insulting their own dignity, in my view, and the further abrogating the responsibility to protect their own citizens. The Israelis are now enabling the support of Hamas, because all aid that goes into Gaza, it is a fantasy to think that the aid doesn't support or help Hamas. And so now they're actively helping their own destroyers. They did that during the war by withholding the full might of their military. They did that by allowing humanitarian aid throughout the war. They did that by allowing aid and food and electricity and water into the Gaza Strip. And now it continues. And I think your point, Ben, is well taken. This isn't merely short-sighted. This isn't merely an unwillingness to think about the long range. This is an unknowing decision to continue an irrational policy. And I think the cost of this will be borne by all those who celebrated this deal.
Yeah, I strongly suspect that if there weren't an incoming administration, that if this deal had been undertaken entirely under the Biden administration, that Trump and his supporters would be attacking it. They would, and they would be attacking it rightly. They would be attacking it precisely because of all the concessions that it makes to Gaza and to Hamas, precisely because it's rewarding them with humanitarian aid. And I suspect so many of the people who voted for Trump, thinking that he was going to unleash Israel, would have condemned that kind of deal. A sizable fraction of those now, though, are kind of going along with Trump. Now, perhaps because of the fact that he wanted to differentiate himself somehow from Biden, that's why we got the next thing that we're going to talk about, which is this sort of real estate deal. And I have to say, when it first came out, it was a bit hard even to know what Trump was talking about when he made his initial statement on February 4th. It's just vague. The Truth Social post was in an unclear subjunctive tense, and it was first interpreted, I think, by many journalists to mean what it ended up actually meaning, which is that he wants to relocate all the Palestinians to Egypt or to Jordan to build them beautiful housing there. Meanwhile, the U.S. would own Gaza, quote unquote, and also rebuild it, but presumably not for the Palestinians because they're not to return. This has been interpreted as so-called ethnic cleansing, something I want to come back to later. But Marco Rubio tried to walk it back, saying, no, this is just temporary. They're going to be relocated while Gaza is rebuilt. But then, since then, Trump has doubled down, saying, no, they'd be permanently relocated. And that accuses, again, the charge of ethnic cleansing. Now, I have to say, I think that is a big red herring, because for the reasons you mentioned earlier, October 7th, in addition to all the numerous attacks Gaza has made against Israel in the past, fully justified Israel in responding brutally. I think Israel had the right to destroy Gaza in response to what happened on October 7th. And it's regularly served as this kind of launch pad for attacks and invasions, all the same grounds you would have had for invading and occupying fully the other occupied territories, like in the Six-Day War, 1967, apply just as much here. And yeah, maybe if Israel did that and occupied, if there were certain Palestinians who wanted to pledge allegiance to Israel, who we could determine were actually innocent, sure, they could be allowed to stay there. But otherwise, no one else has the right to stay there. So this ethnic cleansing charge that it's some kind of racist policy just to eliminate a people is completely baseless. In war, you have the right to fight the nation that is attacking you, and that means destroying them sometimes if necessary. And so the issue here, the problem with Trump's proposal is not the so-called ethnic cleansing. It's that in spite of moving them out of the country, it's still going to reward them. I mean, Trump goes out of his way to characterize what he wants to build for the Gazans, whether it's in Egypt or Jordan or whatever, as this beautiful thing that we're going to do for them. And this is the part that gets ignored by the mainstream media coverage. The mainstream media only focuses in on the lines from Trump that talk about permanently relocating them. It doesn't talk about all the other things that he wants to do for them. I'll quote directly from some of the things that Trump said in his initial statement. He wants to build various domains that will ultimately be occupied by the million Palestinians living in Gaza, ending the death and destruction and frankly bad luck. But the people will be able to live in comfort and peace, and we'll make sure something really spectacular is done. The only reason the Palestinians want to go back to Gaza is they have no alternative. They instead can occupy all of a beautiful area with homes and safety, and they can live in their lives in peace and harmony instead of having to go back to do it again. There are several delusions we'll come back to there, but the main one I want to stress here is he is talking about building beautiful homes for killers. He's talking about rewarding them for their aggression. And it doesn't matter if he's doing it in another country. This is way worse than any kind of humanitarian aid we've given Gazans in the past. Because he's talking about building them a whole new beautiful place. And anybody who's in the past been outraged by whatever kind of foreign aid the U.S. gives to Gaza should be triply outraged by this. Sadly, not too many of them are right now.
I want to challenge the context of this issue in the way that you pointed out. The way this is being reported is incomplete, and you've brought to the surface the sacrificial aspect of this, that it's giving rewards to killers and people who support killers and people who enable them. I think the question on the table is what happens to the Hamas supporting inhabitants of Gaza. That's the wrong question. And the whole discussion about whether this real estate deal is it a Trump project? Is it a U.S. government project? How would it work? What would the neighboring countries? I don't care about any of those things. Those are not the questions. Those are not question number one. They're not even question number 80 on the list of things that are important. The first question, the paramount question, and this is, notice nobody's asking this question. The paramount question: what are the Palestinians going to do to right the wrongs they committed, they enabled, they actually made possible since October 7th, prior to October 7th? How are they making whole the actual victims, thousands of them, and the families of the victims in Israel who were slaughtered, who were raped, and who were burned alive? How are they going to make good those wrongs? Where's the apology of Hamas? Where's the apology of the Palestinians? to Israel? Where's the apology to the rest of the world for squandering billions of dollars of aid to build tunnels, to conduct war, and to inflict untold suffering? To me, those are questions 1 through 50. How do you right that wrong? And I don't know that you could actually right that wrong, but if you were concerned with justice, if you're concerned with giving people what they deserve and judging them objectively, that is what you would be asking. How is Israel going to be made right? Not what do we do for the Palestinians who now are homeless and destitute? Yeah, that is a question. It's not number one, and it's not even top 100 question. And I think the whole discussion around the real estate project is an inversion of that. It's, well, let's talk about what to do with the Palestinians. How do we solve this problem? Is it a two-state? No, let's get away from the two-state solution. Let's send them to the Sinai. Let's send them to Egypt. Let's send them to Jordan. I don't care about that. And I don't think anybody should care about that. The first question every one of those people should be asking themselves in Gaza, who's telling us on television and in newspapers that they're hungry and starving and destitute, what are you doing to right the wrongs that you were complicit in, or worse than complicit, actively involved in? What are you doing to denounce the release of 1,000 prisoners in exchange for 30? What did you do to release the hostages who were there? How did you help undo the wrongs? And I think that is what you would be obsessed with if you were concerned with justice, if you were concerned with any genuine interest in morality. And to me, this idea, and I think you're right, that this is in effect rewarding people who either are killers or enabled killers or complicit with killers. That is another expression of what we talked about earlier, that kind of moral inversion that comes from the self-sacrificial moral premise, which is, well, our only interest now is what do we do with the people who are suffering in Gaza? And look at them, they're intense. Yes, there is suffering. Is it deserved? Maybe they should suffer more because they haven't been defeated. Maybe the fact that they're chanting in the streets and going to these rallies that Hamas is organizing, maybe that's a sign that you should question whether they really deserve any of your help. So to me, this is a really profound inversion. And we can talk a bit about this real estate deal, because I find it, in some ways, it's amusing because, yeah, it's a good way to get out of the two-state problem that nobody really wants. But is it even close to realistic? Because I think what you're pointing to, Ben, is it's a similar kind of blindness to ideas and to really thinking in terms of principles. It's a view that, well, yeah, if they just had a nice place to live, it will be peace and the region will be pacified and everything will be great. Well, have you ever thought about what's going on in Gaza? What ideas animate these people? What led them to enable and conduct and be part of the slaughter that they launched on October 7th and since? That the notion that Palestinians could be bought off with some humanitarian or welfare aid, that was the policy of Israel prior to October 7th. It didn't work, and it can't work because what you're blind to are the ideas that they are embedded in this community, endorsed and beloved. These are the ideas that Hamas champions. The idea that it's Islamic totalitarian rule is a good idea, and slaughtering people who live next to you because they're not Muslims and because you think of them as oppressive to you, wrongly you think that is justified. Those are what animate a whole community of people. You can't wish that away. You can't rewrite those facts as much as you wish you could. And no amount of rebuilding or real estate development can erase the political and ideological reality. So to me, in those two ways, it's a bizarre and absurd quasi-solution. It's not a solution.
Yeah, the blindness to the role of ideas that you mentioned is particularly important and interesting. It points to an underlying view of human nature that politicians and diplomats appeal to in order to rationalize what is, in fact, a form of self-sacrifice, what is, in fact, enabling your own destroyers. And what it amounts to is, no, these killers, they're just like you and me. They want to live. They want to be rich. Everybody wants to live and everybody wants to be rich, this idea holds. And so the fact that they say that they want to kill us, that they say they want their own death, as long as they can bring us down, they don't really mean that. They can be bought off like anybody else. Everybody's open to a deal. It's this pragmatist worldview that assumes that everyone is short-sightedly focused on narrow financial gains in the way that perhaps the politicians themselves are. But it's just not true. It's not just the case that the Palestinians, the Islamists in charge of Palestinian territories, have ideas that dedicate them to the destruction of Israel and dedicate them to the destruction of the West generally. It's that they've time and again indicated their willingness to practice these ideas, their willingness to take death over life. I mean, the symbol of this is the suicide bomber. The suicide bomber has nothing to gain from their death, and likewise, the governments that engage in mass suicide, in effect, when they launch wars against militarily superior foe like Israel. I mean, the Gaza leadership has already been decimated, but they were willing to take it because they were after their vision of an ideal, which for them is death and destruction. Trump repeatedly says they don't want to go back and deal with destruction and death, but they do. They clearly do. And this has been proven by history over and over again. They've been given comforts. They've been given aid. They've been allowed to build new buildings in the Gaza Strip. And it hasn't stopped them for a minute from allowing them to be destroyed whenever they support the people who invite that destruction. And this is the fundamental reason why Trump's modus operandi, and it's not just Trump, it's pretty much the mentality of every major diplomatic initiative of American foreign policy in the last 50 some years. But with Trump, it's very explicit. He believes in the art of the deal. He believes everyone's open to a deal, and it's just a naive view of human nature that everyone actually wants life and happiness. And history shows it's not the case. In fact, people have free will. People can choose to reject life. They often do. It's maybe a little hard to understand, but you have to understand it when so much of the history of this region is written in the blood that flows because these people don't want to live.
I think you put it in terms of pragmatism, and I think it's worth just underlining that pragmatism is loosely used to refer to being practical, solving things, getting to solutions. And what I take from your comment is pragmatism is a distinctive philosophic position, and you don't have to be someone who went to grad school in philosophy to act on it. In fact, it's the default view in American society. It's a very characteristic American attitude of don't bother me with ideas. Nobody really takes those seriously. The hot air. We're just about solving problems. And that's the most benign way you can think of it. The reality of it is what we're seeing today. Is this idea that you can ignore the actual ideological commitments of people. It's a blindness to ideas. Maybe more deeply, it's a blindness to the role of ideas per se, or even philosophic ideas. It's a philosophy blindness. And I think one of the lessons I take from Ayn Rand is that you really cripple your ability to understand the world, to understand yourself and other people and political situations, cultural issues, if you discount the role of philosophy. In fact, understanding the role of philosophy, as she argues, and I believe is true, is really the way to unlock a lot of puzzles and confusions and conflicts, because this is really what's at issue in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Israeli-Hamas conflict, the Middle East conflict, however you characterize it at different times, different parts of history. This is what is most little understood. And I think it's because of this pragmatist mentality that they're blind to the role of ideas. They don't really take seriously that the people on the other side mean to kill you, and they mean to kill you because of certain ideas they hold. And it's decades of deal making, as if one further piece of paper in a deal making, one other provision in a deal, when the people across the table are not people you could ever make a deal with. It's inherently appeasing to sit down with someone like that. And I think it goes to what you're describing. This is the flowering of pragmatism in thinking. Flowering it makes it sound like a good thing, but it's the expression of this mentality. And I think it creates more problems than people really appreciate. So to me, this is, if you want to understand how we got here, this is a major part of the explanation. This mentality of ignoring the role of philosophy, ignoring the role of ideas, and imagining that everyone is equally could be bought off, just as American politicians can be bought off. And deal making is just that's the art. That's where the leverage comes from. It's not at all true.
Yeah, so the blindness to philosophical ideas here is that the pragmatic foreign policy exemplifies is twofold. It's ignoring the role of the ideas of your enemy, ignoring that they can act on evil, destructive ideas. And then it also means ignoring the need to act on rational ideas of your own, and ignoring the need in particular to act on moral principles, the moral principles that should guide you when you are dealing with killers, that should tell you, don't compromise with them, don't deal with them, don't negotiate with them. The only thing you can do is fight them. And Elan, this last conversation that we've had reminds me of something that Ayn Rand wrote back in 1972. Now, she's writing this on the occasion of Nixon's trip to China to negotiate with Chairman Mao. And I would say, if anything, what she says then applies doubly so to Trump wanting to negotiate with Hamas. But listen to what she had to say about this. She said, "International politics is not a smoke-filled back room, a party caucus, or a congressional committee. The tactics, the methods, and the stakes involved are not the same. It's not like promising a new dam to a senator from Iowa in exchange for his vote for a bill to provide school lunches, or like half promising the same government contract to 5 different people in unmentioned but understood exchange for a campaign contribution. The trickiest American manipulators are crude, naive, and innocent compared to their European or Asian counterparts. Horse traders is the usual epithet describing American politicians. The foreign ones are death traders." And if anyone is a death trader, I think Hamas certainly qualifies. And anyone who's fooled by the idea that the various deals someone like Trump wants to propose to deal with these death traders, I think they're only going to expect more death in the future. So, Elan, I think we should wrap up and mention a few resources that our audience may want to listen to. One, first of all and foremost, is this resource page on the commentary that the ARI has had since October 7th, just to show you our record of speaking in defense of Israel and its right to wage war against terrorists like those in Gaza, like Hamas. Also, your book, Elan, What Justice Demands, written before October 7th, but prescient on all the kinds of applications of moral principles that we've been talking about. And last of all, you mentioned some of the things that I had written on this subject, Elan, and I wrote an essay, "We Ignore the Unconditional Right to Self-Defense at Our Peril." That's from New Ideal, November 15th, 2023. So if you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our channel on YouTube. Click the bell to get notifications for when we go live or post new recordings. If you're watching the recording, please be sure to leave comments, to like it, to share, to help attract new viewers to this channel. If you have questions or comments on this episode, send us an email to newideal@aynrand.org. We read all the emails that come in and sometimes take your suggestions to do episodes. But thanks again, Elan, for joining me to discuss this topic. It's I think, a distressing one, and one that we really have to still be firm about in our analysis.